This is the fund summary. It's going to be presented Monday night at the meeting, and it's the support for the budget for 2020 and supporting the request to uh, implement the Homestead Act. It also is the basis to determine how much uh, the taxes will be. So this is a fairly important document. And the problem with this document, as presented to the public and to the board, is that it doesn't make any sense. And I'm going to go through this and try to point out all the little discrepancies that I see in this document. And so we'll start first with a little bit of information that kind of reflects how bad things are here. And the problem with this document, this particular one, is this is like the third iteration of this document. So they've issued ones earlier, but you can see there's no date on this document. There's no revision number, so you could be talking to someone about this summary and they might have a different one, so the numbers would not match. This is a pretty good indication of how raw and amateurish Mr. Granger is. I mean, he 40 years of experience, and there's no date and no revision number. And I'd have to also hold the accounting department responsible for this as well. It really causes a lot of problems, and you would think that after 40 years, Mr. Granger would know how to put together a fund summary, but apparently he doesn't know how to do it. And as we go through this, you'll see how terrible this document really is. So if we look at A, which is basically a pretty good list of all of our funds, the general fund being the most important one. And you'll see that at the very end of this list of funds, all of a sudden there's an equipment fund thrown in there without a fund number. And that's because they're just creating this one. And we'll talk about that later when we get to the 2020 budget. But the list, the key one is the general fund, where most of all the resources that the township collects, such as property taxes, income taxes, and fees that are charged for various purposes, go into the general fund. And the general fund then resources would be compared to the expenses, and we would hope that at least for a budget we would have a balanced general fund budget. You can see here that there are other funds: the sewer fund, the Gulf Operation Fund, the RCC Food and Beverage Fund. These are funds that typically generate revenue because they're proprietary funds. They're businesses. I think most people are familiar with those funds. The other funds pretty much rely on money from the general fund, are from borrowings when we issue bonds to the public to raise money. A few of them have some income, but it's minimal. Then if you look at item B, which is the 2019 estimates, there are quite a bit of information here. In this case, it looks like he's trying to show us that in 2019, you have the first column of resources. So this is the money that was allocated for the various funds. The general fund again would have the revenue coming in from income taxes, property taxes, various fees that we charge. The other funds that would generate revenue would be the sewer fund, which will go away in 2020, the Golf Operations Fund, and the RCC Food and Beverage Fund. What's interesting is the sewer fund, they're showing revenue of $6.7 million, but expenses of $9.8 million for a deficit of $3 million. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as we go through this. But what's really annoying to me is the Golf and Food and Beverage Fund. Those two funds, prior to the arrival of Lisa Vanderlane and John Granger, combined, they were providing us with revenue between $2.5 and $3 million a year. And you can see it's now under $700,000. It's absolutely depressing to see what they've done to this beautiful country club. And we can't blame anyone but the Board of Supervisors and the manager, John Granger. Deplorable performance for our township and terrible maintenance of the assets. So you'll see the second column is the expenses. There is situations here where the expenses make absolutely no sense, but I'll explain to you why. And then finally, the third column is excess and our deficits in parentheses. That would show the losses from that particular fund, our overspending compared to the resources. So, and that would be column B2. You can see that they're reporting at our general fund, which is our most important and primary fund. They expect $628,000 deficit. So we're spending more than what we're bringing in on taxes, for property taxes and income taxes and general fees that we charge. This fund should really be balanced. We should insist on having resources to cover all the anticipated budgeted expenses. But this hasn't happened, like I said, for 5 years. And there's no rhyme or reason for this to happen. It should not be happening. But we're basically borrowing money from the future or spending down whatever reserves we might have. And so if you see, we have B3 at the bottom, and I added that total because you'll notice that none of these columns are totaled up in section B. But if you add up the excess and deficit and you believe that number, we will be incurring a $5.3 million deficit for 2019. Now, I'd like to claim that they're losing money for us, but it's misleading. I'm not sure we're going to lose $5.3 million, and I'll point out a couple reasons why that is the case. We go back to the sewer fund, where we show $6.6 million in resources, but expenses of $9.7 million. So we have a deficit of over $3 million. Well, the problem with that is that $9.7 million, they moved $7 million of money, of fund balance money out of the sewer fund to someplace else. And that's why it looks like there's a deficit. In reality, we could show this sewer fund at minimum breaking even. But we know, well, they don't want you to know this, but I know that the fund has been making between $2 and $4 million a year in profit. The sewer fund has. Well, we're going to lose that in 2020. That's gone forever. But if you add in some of the $7 million they moved out to make that zero, you would have $4 million left over. And so I'm thinking that's our deficit for 2019 is going to be about $1.3 million. And they'll make that up from using that $7 million that they moved out to cover that. In addition, they've used 2.2 million or so of the 7 million to buy the promenade. So this isn't a very comprehensive record of what's happening in 2019 because they're only showing or attempting to show the resources minus the expenses equals the excess or deficit for that year. And I'll explain why that's different from column C, as you just see this fireworks exploding here. And column C is an attempt to show us what the 2020 budget is. And you'll see that it has the same columns, the first two columns as 2019. They have resources. So you would think that this would be the resources they're going to garner or collect in 2020. And then they show the expenses. And again, you would think that these are the expenses they're going to incur for 2020. But then the third column is really part of the issues I see with this. Instead of having excess and deficit, this is called the fund balance. Okay? So they're mixing information together that would confuse anyone. I know it's confused me, and it's going to confuse anyone else that tries to understand what's going on here. So to look at column C, it's not really resources minus expenses as it is in part B, or is it? We don't know. Sometimes it looks like it's the fund balance. Sometimes it looks like it might be the resources allocated for that fund minus the expenses. And I'll point out what I mean in some of these situations. It's so confusing. It's unbelievable. And it's incredible. I mean, a 12th grader could do a better job on this than what Granger has done with his 40 years of experience and his finance people who have MBAs making $100,000 a year. It simply makes no sense. And if you see C3, which is the adding up the fund balance column, and you'll note also that all three of these columns are added up, but they didn't add up the columns in section B. So why did they do that? It's a question that I don't have an answer for it, but I would think to add further confusion to what's going on. But if you look at C3, it shows that they're going to have a positive balance of $3.2 million. But that's not an excess deficit number. And it's not the total fund balances that we would have at the end of 2020. We just sold the sewer plant. We should have a lot more money than $3.2 million. What fund is that money sitting in? So it's even more confusing to that extent as well. Then we need to look at a couple things here I'll point out to you. For example, C4. Now, that certainly looks like it's just a fund balance. So they moved some resources into what they call the apparatus fund. It's now got $1 million in it, and the fund balance is $1 million. So if you look at across in the B section, well, they had resources of $668. They spent $825. They had a deficit of $156,000. But in all these situations, one major column is missing, and that is what was the beginning fund balance. So that we don't know what that was in this fund summary, and that makes it even more confusing. So if you were to take out the million that I'm showing at C4, obviously the 3.2 million at the bottom in C3 would be $1 million less. So that would be 2.2 million. And then if we look at C5, which this equipment fund all of a sudden appeared, showing 5 million in resources, then they're going to spend 713,000 in 2020 for a fund balance of 4.3 million. And so if you subtract that out of the 3.2 million, along with the 1 million from C4, you can see that we're looking at a deficit of 2 million. But of course, it's not really a deficit because it's not calculated the same way as it is in column B2, which is excess/deficit. C2, they're calling a fund balance. So is everyone as confused as I am right now? We should be. This is absolutely crazy, weird mathematics. Then if you look at the last item here, C6, I point out this $1.2 million. It's kind of odd, isn't it? We no longer have a sewer fund, but they're telling us that in 2020, the sewer fund is going to have resources of 10 million, but they're going to spend 1.2 million. But if you delve into the detail of the budget, what you'll find out is that the 1.2 million of expenses in the sewer fund, Fund 08, really aren't expenses for that fund. It is moved up into the resources of the general fund. It's part of the $12,653,462 reported as resources for the general fund. So they mix this stuff up, they're moving it around, it goes out from there and then it goes into somewhere else. It can be very confusing, and it was done in order to hide the fact that the general fund in 2020 is also going to have a significant deficit. Because along with the $1.2 million that they moved into the general fund resources, there's another $670,000 that is in the budget in that number that represents the interest off of all the monies that we collected, proceeds of the sewer fund generating interest. And they're saying that $670,000 of the interest earned they're going to put in the general fund as well. So they're putting things in there that normally would be reported as just the property taxes, the income taxes, and the other fees that are charged that go into the general fund. They're adding these items in there as well that kind of skews the total resources that are generated from normal activities within the township. And I say normal because at some point in time, right, the interest is no longer going to be generated when we have spent all the sewer funds, and they're not going to have any money like $1.2 million to move in there to cover these deficits that they're spending year after year. So the real deficit, what is the real deficit of the general fund? Well, I predict that if we go ahead the way that we are going, that in 2020 we'll have incurred another 2 million plus in deficits. And that, of course, will be made up with the funds from the proceeds from the sewer plant. And my theory on all this, of course, is when we finally run out of all the sewer proceeds, we're going to be faced with the bad habit of spending $2 or $3 million a year in deficit spending. And that's when my theory of the Exeter tax time bomb is going to explode. And we're going to need to raise the rates, the millage for taxes significantly. So it's not going to be nice. It's going to be terrible. And these guys will tell you that they think that's going to be out 10 years. I don't see it happening that way. They're going through this money like a drunken sailor on shore leave, or a hot knife through butter. I predict that all this money will be spent and gone probably even before the 5 years are up. And this is another reason why I'm asking them to not implement the Homestead Act. Because what exasperates this deficit is the fact that they're going to cut taxes by somewhere around $800,000 is what the Lone Granger has said in the last meeting. But you can never believe what he says. He's, not very good at predicting numbers or giving us good information. But I do concede that it's probably $800,000, $900,000 that we'll lose in taxes because of the Homestead Act. Now, I'd like to not pay more taxes, but if we're practical and we want to run this township properly and efficiently and minimize the pain that comes along with taxation, then we should really stop these guys from implementing the Homestead Act. This is a ploy that Granger has used in all of the other places where he's worked. And it's been a terrible nightmare for a lot of these communities that eventually followed this idea. And this is why he averages about 3 years per township that he's worked at. It takes them 3 years to figure out that this guy knows absolutely nothing. So that we need to get to this meeting on Monday night, and we need to insist that this terrible board of supervisors, these inept performers, do no more damage to our township. We've got to stop them from putting in over $9 million into the police pension fund. It's not necessary at this time. We can earn 2% or more on $9 million. It'll be a nice increment to our reserves. What will happen also is that you'll hear from some of the supervisors that, well, let's put it in the police pension fund because we only get 2% if the township manages at 2% return, but we could get 6% in the police pension fund. Really? Well, let me point this out. In 2018, the pension fund lost over 5%. They lost over $1 million, okay? Now, to make that up, if they were to only expect the least risk amount of 2% return, they'd have to have a 9% return just to make back the $1 million plus the small, less risky return of 2%. They'd have to earn 9%. That's not going to happen, okay? And again, put it in the police pension fund where we could lose the money, or keep it in our control where we can at least earn 2% until it's needed. We fund the police pension fund. I'm not saying don't fund it. I'm saying right now it's adequately funded. We can hold on to this money until it's necessary to put some more into the police pension fund. But in the meantime, we can earn interest on this that will help support the projects that we must undertake. And we have quite a bit of things that need to be done. We just found out that they haven't been maintaining the Reading Country Club properly, and this is one of the things that they're chartered with doing, and they haven't done it. But back to the fund summary. This page, this information is absolutely deplorable. It's confusing, it's misrepresenting the facts, and I think it was designed to confuse you. I really need you folks to show up at the meeting on Monday and express your displeasure with these guys. I don't think there's going to be a second meeting in December, so this will be the last time that you can tell Mr. Crusadis what you think about his management of our township, and insist that they do no actions and they wait until the new supervisors are in place. I want to thank you for looking at this slide and listening to my interpretation of this very confusing document that does not really represent what is going on in our community. Thank you.